Last week, while I was on a working retreat in New York, I was delighted that there were 4 dogwood trees blooming outside my room. I could see 2 of them through the window every time I walked through the door. It was a fantastic sight, made even more welcome because of a choice my back fence neighbors here in Missouri made last winter when they cut down their own dogwood tree. Its limbs would grow into my yard where I could get a close-up view of each spring's flowers. I missed that this year. I don't think my neighbor's tree was targeted. I doubt my neighbors got up one morning and thought, wow, I'd really like to cut down the dogwood tree today. It was more probably a case of wrong place, wrong time. They were grading out some of their yard and clearing out the fence row, which had some small mulberry and elm saplings, and they just completely removed everything that was there, including the dogwood tree. I'd taken photos of that tree's bloom since we had moved there in 2018, and now, this spring, there was an empty space where the blooms used to be. Again, I doubt my neighbors knew what they did. Who cuts down dogwood trees? And I appreciate a clean fence row, but their good intentions didn't stop them from cutting down something beautiful. Humans excel at hubris. We just do not, or we cannot be bothered to stop and pay attention. It takes a lot of intentional effort to slow down and do things purposefully. It's too inconvenient to ask, what trees are growing here? Are they all the same? Do I want to preserve any of them? We're almost always short on the things that care requires: time, energy, attention, curiosity, patience. I don't mean this as a complaint against my neighbors. They cut down a dogwood tree probably without knowing it, and I had taken the time to notice it. So that invites me to ask, what is it that I have rushed past? Where have I been quicker to cut than to care? It's not such a big deal when we're talking about what grows in my backyard, but it's another thing entirely when we turn to the cumulative impacts of human hubris. Nowhere is this more obvious or addressing it more urgent than the case of climate change, climate justice. On the plus side, we have had many wonderful people paying attention to these issues, empowering us with the knowledge and actions we need to make good choices. I was in high school when the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, issued their first report in 1992, and I remember feeling hopeful that humans were actually taking steps to address what would otherwise be a looming catastrophe. The IPCC is impressive and important. Damian Carrington, an environment editor at The Guardian, described its work as, quote, thousands of the world's best scientists distilling the latest global research into reports that are then signed off by all the governments in the world. The reports are gold standard statements on the reality and dangers of climate change and arguably the greatest scientific endeavor in history, end quote. Carrington went on to summarize the findings and recommendations of each of the 6 IPCC reports. The first, from 1992, even led to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, an annual summit where leaders from around the world could meet together, discuss, and commit to climate action. I was a university student when the second report was released in 1995. The emphasis was again on recognizing the human actions driving climate change, with the idea that if we acknowledged our part in it, surely we would do something about it. But it went further than the first report, noting that, quote, climate change is likely to have wide-ranging and mostly adverse impacts on human health, with significant loss of life. The risks included extreme high-temperature events, floods, and droughts. It advised that we collectively act immediately, not waiting for all the data to become known before taking decisive action. It would be better, wiser, and more compassionate to act now, quote, to take precautionary measures to anticipate, prevent, or minimize the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse effects. Surely such a conclusion, spoken by our best scientists and with the authority of the United Nations, would move us to action, right? Not so much. The third report came in 2001 when my family was living in a cabin, doing our best to learn and practice sustainable and regenerative living. And the IPCC increased their warnings and calls for action. It was the starkest pronouncement yet. Quote, greenhouse gas forcing in the 21st century could set in motion large-scale, high-impact, nonlinear, and potentially abrupt changes in physical and biological systems over the coming decades to millennia. Scientists noted that, quote, rising socioeconomic costs related to weather damage and to regional variations, end quote, indicated that human societies were vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. This was going to change our lives. It was going to impact us and the human community. They appealed to our sense of compassion and to our sense of justice by pointing out that it would be developing countries and the poor persons within all countries who suffered the most. Surely that would move us to action, right? Not so much. By 2007, when the fourth report was released, we were living in Cambodia. The science had definitely caught up with the precautions by this time so that the report could state that, quote, most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse concentrations. The warnings in the report were also starker, emphasizing that further delays to reduce emissions would make it significantly more difficult, quote, to achieve lower stabilization levels and increase the risk of more severe climate change impacts. The economic considerations were also clear. Failure to act now would be to recklessly prioritize short-term profits over long-term economic well-being. Quote, the benefits of strong and early action far outweigh the economic costs of not acting. Delay would be dangerous and much more costly. You would think that would move us to action, right? Of course, the financial collapse of 2008 quickly took up most of the world's attention. By 2014, with my family firmly settled in Missouri, the reports start to feel increasingly resigned. The warnings are given in the context of continued emissions, spoken with an awareness that this is our likely course. Quote, continued emissions will cause further warming and long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasing the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. The report also shifts from mainly preventing impacts to also adapting to impacts that are becoming more inevitable. Yet even with this encouragement, there is almost a grief, at least when I read it, that, quote, adaptation can reduce the risks of climate change impacts, but there are limits to its effectiveness, especially with greater magnitudes and rates of climate change. In 2018, the IPCC released a special report. It was an alarm bell of sorts that we studied and discussed together along with the Green New Deal on Earth Day in 2019 to draw attention to the importance of doing everything we can to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. By comparing impacts between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, the report makes it clear how significant that half a degree of global heating really is. Just this amount of restraint on our part would spare millions of people from extreme heat and the ravages of drought. As Professor Johan Rockström said, quote, climate change is occurring earlier and more rapidly than expected. Even at the current level of 1 Celsius warming, it is painful. This report is really important. It has scientific robustness that shows 1.5 Celsius is not just a political concession. There's growing recognition that 2 Celsius is dangerous. And yet, the report also acknowledges the proverbial hole we have dug for ourselves at this time. Just to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius, carbon dioxide emissions would have to decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by the year 2030. Last March, the IPCC issued the final section of its 6th report popularly called a final warning for the world to do what it needs to do to address climate change. The first sections focused on, first, the physical science of climate change and its resulting and increasingly irreversible crisis. Second, it talks about the impacts of this crisis, such as rising sea levels and what that will mean for human societies and our natural ecologies. And third, it addresses the actions we can and must take to limit these impacts as much as possible, such as using renewable energy and capturing carbon dioxide. March's final section synthesized, brought together all of this information and translated it into suggested policies for governments. The urgency and the importance of these actions are at critical levels. This is quite literally a life and death issue on a planetary scale. It's unethical for us to fail to act, and the costs that are now and will be paid in human and ecological suffering have been largely avoidable. We've known for decades what needed to be done, and yet we have failed to do so. In particular, this has been a failure of the most powerful and wealthy among us. As we discussed back in 2019, the most wealthy 10% are responsible for 50% of the individual produced fossil fuel emissions. Oxfam estimated that the carbon footprints of the richest 10% are 60 times higher than the globe's poorest 10%. That's about 3.5 billion people. And on the corporate level, only 100 companies are responsible for about 71% of greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, it's the very wealthy and powerful among us who have been literally willing to risk the suffering and death of millions upon millions of people in their pursuit of accumulating money and power. They have been willing to risk massive ecological collapse of the planet in order to satisfy insatiable greed. And unfortunately, resistance to change is still considered a legitimate response to these climate realities. Fiona Harvey, also an environment editor at The Guardian, reported last month that, quote, in the final hours of deliberations of the IPCC report, the large Saudi Arabian delegation of at least 10 representatives pushed at several points for the weakening of messages on fossil fuels and the insertion of references to carbon capture and storage, touted by some as a remedy for fossil fuel but not yet proven to work at scale, end quote. But as regrettable as this response is, Saudi Arabia shouldn't take the bulk of our attention on this count. No, we need to look no farther than the United States of America to see how far political leaders will go to prevent meaningful action on climate change. As one example, you're probably familiar with a senator from West Virginia blocking this kind of action, and if you immediately thought of Senator Manchin, you wouldn't be wrong. After all, as Amina Bustillo and Laura Bischoff observed last year, quote, since mid-2021, Senate Democrats and the Biden administration have repeatedly entered into negotiations with Manchin to advance action on climate change, only to have him shoot down the proposals. Manchin's home state of West Virginia faces grave threats from floods supercharged by climate change. At the same time, it's a major producer of coal and natural gas. Manchin himself has personal financial ties to the coal industry, and he's gotten more campaign donations from the fossil fuel sector than any other senator, end quote. As true as all that is, that's not the senator I first had in mind. Going back to 1993, within a year of the IPCC's first report, West Virginia's then Senator Robert Byrd used his position on the Senate Appropriations Committee to block a tax on carbon emissions. The Clinton administration pivoted to an energy tax that also stalled in the face of opposition politicians and fossil fuel lobbyists, and it never became a law. Byrd was then instrumental in helping block the USA from making commitments to reduce fossil fuel emissions as outlined in the Kyoto Protocol. He spent much of his political career opposing actions that would protect the environment, but that also would endanger the profitability of coal mining. And though it's true that at the end of his life he was starting to embrace the science of climate change, it was too little, too late. At his death, Senator Manchin took up his mantle and join the long U.S. tradition of failing to address the urgent needs related to climate justice. In Shannon Osaka's words, quote, "The last 3 decades of U.S. climate policy look like a graveyard of failed bills. Carbon taxes have died on the Senate floor and been torched by attack ads. Cap-and-trade systems have been endorsed and then abandoned by Republicans and Democrats alike. According to the Climate Change Performance Index, the U.S. is 55th in the world when it comes to climate policy." And there's lots to discuss and explore when it comes to the reasons behind our collective failure to care for our planet and ourselves. And Osaka outlines several of those points, especially in the political sphere. But for this moment, I want to bring attention to the window of opportunity we have right now. Last month, the Pew Research Center documented that public support for climate action has grown. For example, they found that nearly 7 in 10 Americans, 69%, were in favor of the United States taking steps to become carbon neutral by 2050. And they also said the U.S. should prioritize developing renewable energy resources, such as wind and solar, over expanding fossil fuel usage. Especially among the youth, this shift is notable. Among Americans aged 18 to 29, 50% say the U.S. should use a mix of energy sources, including fossil fuels, while about as many, 48%, say the U.S. should exclusively use renewables. It's a fantastic shift in the culture. 2/3 of Americans think the federal government should encourage domestic production of wind and solar power. 2/3 of Americans say large businesses and corporations are doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. And majorities also say their state elected officials, 58%, and the energy industry, 55%, are also doing too little to address climate change. In an earlier survey from May 2022, Pew found that a similar share of Americans, 58%, said the federal government should do more to reduce the effects of global climate change. It's wonderful, but there's also a gap. The Pew study also revealed that even though a majority of Americans view climate change as a major threat, quote, "it's a lower priority than issues such as strengthening the economy and reducing healthcare costs." Only 37% of respondents called climate change a top priority, while 34% that it was an important but lower priority. And when they say that, they don't mean just a little lower. In a January survey, climate change only ranked 17 out of 21 national issues, way down the list. There's also, as you might anticipate, a partisan divide that's important to note. 59% of Democrats identified climate change as a top priority, compared to only 13% of Republicans. What stands out to me with these statistics is that while we continue to press forward on policy, we also need to continue to press forward on culture, because humans excel at hubris. We just do not, or we cannot be bothered to stop and pay attention. It takes a lot of intentional effort to slow down and do things purposefully. From the mundane joy of noticing a dogwood tree growing on a fence row, to the life and death necessity of taking seriously the impacts of climate change, we are too often short on the things that care requires: time, energy, attention, curiosity, patience. Later this month, I plan to return to this topic from the lens of spiritual and reflective practice, because paying attention like this is the heart of many spiritual and scientific practices across time, cultures, and geographies. In the meantime, I hope you can remember the image of that fallen dogwood tree and its hard lesson. It's quicker to cut than to care. But there is no time left to value short-term profits over long-term health. It took billions of years for those blooms to grow on my back fence row. It was an act of love to notice, listen, and give thanks for them. How much more this very planet Earth, our only home. It took billions of years for all this beauty to blossom, a vibrant and interconnected web of living and dying and living again. If humanity is to have a future here, it is imperative that we notice, listen, and act right now. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.